Okay, awesome. All right, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Mission Driven Made podcast. I want to welcome Dr. Joseph Munoz to the show. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show today.
Of course, my pleasure.
And before we started, though, I just wanted to say how appreciative I am of all the content you and your colleagues put out. There is such an unbelievable amount of false information and I guess you could say false marketing in the fitness industry. And it seems like there's so few people trying to combat that.
Certainly. I mean, I think a big issue is that um, when it comes to nutrition and training, the stuff that is evidence-based is not sexy. It's very straightforward and relatively boring compared to some of the other claims that are made that are obviously not true. So I think for that sense is one of the reasons why a lot of the fake information gets a lot of attention in the media. It's because it almost seems like relatively magical in terms of the claims that they're making. So it's more attractive from like, I guess, a marketing or a sales standpoint where people see them, they're like, wow. So that information spreads quickly, whereas the information that we put out, which is mainly based just on consistency and hard work over time, is not as attractive to most people.
Yeah, I talked about this a little bit with David Mathis a few months ago and like
Mhm.
the reason why. And I know you said it's not, sexy and everything. But my question is like, do these people know that they're promoting false information? That's the thing I haven't really figured out yet.
I think they have to a certain extent. So every once in a while, there will be one of these claims from one of these people. For example, like a couple months back, um, I'm not sure if you're familiar with who Jason Fung is. He,
Yes, he's the carnivore or keto guy or something.
yeah, he was essentially just on an interview, pretty big interview, talking about how carbohydrates are like the devil, pretty much, right? Um, and I would assume this guy has a medical degree. If he doesn't know he's putting out misinformation, it's his responsibility to know he's putting out misinformation, because you can't be at a high level of education and claim just to be ignorant, right? Which they aren't. They're pretty much saying that their information is true. But like you mentioned, if they don't know that they are spreading misinformation, that is almost just as crazy to me as spreading misinformation knowingly, right? It's
Right.
almost worse. Like, how'd you get to where you are with that level of ignorance? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess I'll never quite understand those people, but
Yeah,
besides doing what you guys are doing, I guess there's not much else, you can really do.
exactly. I mean, with social media, people are going to follow and listen to the information that they decide to listen to. But thankfully, if there is more information that's truthful out there, then just a larger percentage of the population will listen to the truthful information. That's the goal, at least for me.
Awesome. And then before we get into talking about you obtaining your PhD from Florida State, can you talk a little bit about where you're from, maybe your upbringing a little bit, and then what led you to go down the path of nutritional sciences?
Certainly. So it's actually kind of a funny story for me because I didn't decide to go into this field till like towards the end of my collegiate career. So I was born and raised in Miami, Florida. I'm actually the first in my family to be born in the US. I am from Cuban descent, so both my parents were born in Cuba. Migrated to Miami, Florida. My dad actually came over early 70s. My mom moved over here early 90s. Um, and I was born and raised Cuban American household. Both of my parents, well, my mom has a college degree. My dad doesn't. My dad's been working construction his whole life. My mom does home healthcare assistant, so she's in the healthcare field. But both of my parents were always into exercising, not so much into the nutritional side of things, but they always exercised, stayed healthy. Although they didn't necessarily know much about nutrition, they made quote unquote healthy choices based off what they knew. So I guess I was introduced to health and fitness at a very young age. And I remember being 12 or 13 and seeing my mom go to the gym and saying things like, Mom, I want to go to the gym. And she was like, You're too young to lift weights, which to a certain extent is not necessarily true, but I guess she didn't know better. And I've been playing sports my whole life. My parents made sure I was always involved in extracurricular activities, grew up playing pretty much every sport. I wasn't too good at any of them until I started swimming competitively. I was a pretty good competitive swimmer, like a middle school, early high school career, but I never really enjoyed it much. And then when I turned 16, for some reason, my mom thought 16 was like the magical age where you could start lifting weights. So I enrolled in a weightlifting class in high school. And I fell in love with lifting weights, honestly, like almost immediately. I just liked the feeling of it. I liked what it could make your body look like, because other sports like swimming and stuff, although they're very rigorous and difficult, they didn't have like the same effects on your body as lifting did. And I just really enjoyed it as soon as I started doing it. And then another big part of my life was music. So I had been playing the guitar since 5th grade and playing saxophone in high school. And when I went into my undergrad, I actually thought my original career path was going to be music. I was part of the marching band at FSU. I used to practice the saxophone like 4 to 5 hours a day. I was very dedicated. And one day I had a conversation with my mom, and she convinced me that it probably wasn't the right career path, because I would be quote unquote broke the rest of my life. And that I might as well maintain that as a hobby and just do something that I enjoy, but I could make a career out of. And so I was dabbling in a couple different fields. Math has always been a subject that I was good at, so I thought maybe I would just be a math major, realized that was kind of boring. And then I just, as an elective, took an intro to nutrition course, the end of my sophomore year, maybe beginning of my junior year in college. And I really enjoyed it. So then I started taking just more courses in the field of physiology, took some metabolism courses, took anatomy courses. And then after like my junior year, I was like, this is it, and I continued with it. And then towards the end of my bachelor degree, so probably second half of my senior year, I remember distinctly being in the library studying for an organic chemistry exam.
Ooh.
And I was with a buddy of mine. I'm like, I'm doing all these hardcore science classes, but I'm going to have a bachelor's degree in nutrition. Like, what can I do with that? And the unfortunate truth is you can't really do much with that unless you have a dietetics degree, and then you can be a dietitian. But the exercise science and nutrition degree is not a dietetics degree. And so I thought about it for a little bit, and I was like, well, I enjoy school and might as well just go for a graduate degree. But I had no clue what a graduate degree entailed. I just know you could go and get a master's degree, and I thought that would give me better career opportunities. And I had no idea what research was. I had no idea what a thesis was. And I kind of just fell into it by chance, honestly. There was a food science professor in my department who has now passed away, unfortunately, but he was one of the most impactful professors I've had, without a doubt. He was from India and had a very old school way of teaching. He was very strict, and he was like known to be, or his course was known to be like one of the tougher courses in the major. To give a little bit more background, my freshman and sophomore year, I was not a good student in terms of like academic adherence. I didn't do well in school, didn't really care about the courses I was taking. But then I took this food science course, and I killed it, had A's in pretty much all the exams, had the highest grade. And I knew that this professor had was heavily involved in the department, and I knew he had some pull. So I spoke with him and let him know, hey, I don't have the GPA for graduate school, but these are my GRE scores. I did really well in the GRE, and he obviously knew I was gifted because I did really well in this course, and that he knew I was interested in the field. So he thankfully pulled for me, and thanks to him, I got into the graduate program here at FSU. So I did my undergrad here at FSU as well. And after 1 year of my master's degree, I had about $25,000 in student loans. And I'm like, this is no good, because I'm getting a graduate degree, but I still didn't know what I was going to do with my career. And I was taking a vitamins and minerals course with a professor. His name was Dr. Arjmandi, who was my PhD mentor. And I spoke to him one day after class about wanting to get involved with research, because FSU is a R1 research institute, which is like the highest level of research. So every professor pretty much does research at FSU. And I asked him if I could be more involved in his lab, because I knew the research he was doing. It was doing clinical research, so actually working with humans, which was what I was interested in. And I was expressing to him that I needed some sort of way to make an income, because I couldn't just continue to take out loans. I get very stressed out about financial situations, so that was stressful for me. And he said, well, I can take you on as a PhD student, and you'll receive a full stipend, and your tuition will be covered for. Are you in? And I didn't even think about it for 2 seconds. I said, yeah, let's go. And the rest is history. So, like I said, I kind of fell into it by chance. Part of it was me just like being at the right place at the right time, but also asking the right questions. That's one thing I try to stress to people, like not to be shy to ask for opportunities, because many of the opportunities that I received, I just asked for them honestly. So I did my PhD with my mentor, learned a whole bunch about what it takes to be successful in clinical research. And my degree was in clinical research. So we worked with populations, so individuals who have diabetes or are obese. We also focus a lot on bone health, so people with osteopenia, which is a low degree of bone loss. But my focus, or like my passion, has always been in the sports nutrition field. So there's another professor at FSU. His name's Dr. Michael Ormsby, who is now my postdoctoral mentor. And I had actually approached him for to be my mentor when I was entering as a PhD student, but he had a full lab. But thankfully, things worked out. I'm working with him now, and his lab focuses on how exercise helps mobilize fatty acid deposits. So we implement a technique known as microdialysis, where we study how fat's mobilized in the adipose tissue due to exercise, essentially. And another big area that we study is pre-bedtime nutrition, particularly protein. But we've done protein feeding studies prior to bed for different populations, so overweight women, all different types of populations, and just seen that like having protein before bed is beneficial and doesn't really have any adverse effects on like energy expenditure, satiety, or anything like that the following day. I know I just spewed a whole bunch of information. That's kind of a little bit of my background.
No, that was great. I loved hearing all that from start to finish there. I did want to backtrack a little bit. So you were talking about going from your master's degree and then getting into the PhD program. So when you got that job offer, if you will, to be a PhD student, you got the stipend you were talking about. Was that how you actually got into the program, or was there like a competitive application process too, or how'd that work?
So when you go in as a master's student, it is a competitive process in terms of like GRE scores, GPA, all those things, right? Coursework. But at the PhD level, if you've proven yourself as a master's student and you have a good relationship with the professor, the professor has to accept you as a student. And then if the professor accepts you as a student and you have the requirements necessary, you're good to go. So it's not necessarily a competitive process coming in as a PhD student. Now, the competitive aspect is that there's limited capability per professor, right? Professors have a certain amount of funding, which allows them to pay for a certain amount of students. And professors who are big in the field tend to have many applicants. So if you're trying to work with a top level professor, it may be difficult because they already have like 5, 6 different people applying for the same position. However, there's no like competitive process, and at least not in my experience, with like certain documents that you have to turn in and all these things, or like essays that you have to write. So for many students who did their master's at FSU that are friends of mine and went for a PhD program elsewhere, perhaps they met a professor at a conference that they were interested in their research, or developed a relationship with a professor at a university because that other professor was friends with the professor that they were working with for their masters, and they spoke to each other. But it's really just who you know and word of mouth. And once you establish that relationship with the person you want to work with, you mentioned you want to work with them, and then if they have an opening, they're likely to just bring you in because they already know your reputation from the professor you've previously worked with. The field of sports nutrition is relatively small. Like when you go to these conferences, you see the same people over and over. And so it's a pretty small knit circle. And like if I'm a professor in the field, and I know my student's interested in working in a specific field that another professor does, and I'm friends with them, I'll be like, hey, just so you know, if you ever have an opening, let me know. My student is a really good hard worker, is doing this work, and he's interested in your field. Let us know if there's an opening. So it's more word of mouth and who you know than anything.
Okay, gotcha. And then all the PhD students like that are accepted in the program, does everyone get a stipend for being there and being part of that? Is that normal?
At FSU, yes. It depends on the funding that the university has. Typically, a larger state-funded university will have that money. So the stipend, you're either a teaching assistant. So if you've taken classes in college, you'll see that you have TAs in your classes. Those are typically PhD students who are funded by the university. Then there's also research assistants that are privately funded by the grants that the professor gets. So like if the professor has a large grant and they want to pay for the student to do research 100% and not teach, then you can get funding through a research grant as well. But most big universities, all PhD students will be funded and don't necessarily have to worry about tuition. The funding is pretty minimal. Like as a PhD student, I was paid $25,000 a year, which is practically nothing. But at the very least, it allowed me to pay my rent, pay for some food, and not have to worry about being in debt after graduating, which is one really big factor that I recommend to people who are like maybe contemplating different avenues for a graduate degree, like medical school or PhD. A lot of the professional degrees end up in large student debt. And if you're scared about that, or that's something that you're not willing to accept, maybe the PhD route may be a little better because you do get funding. And at the very least, you make enough to live.
Awesome. And then while you were in school and researching the different foods and the prevention of certain diseases, like you said, like diabetes, and then was it osteoporosis?
Yeah.
And did you find anything significant during your research?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you a little bit of background on the projects I worked on. My first project that I worked on, we were working on a pre-diabetic population. So there's a vegetable known called bitter melon. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. It's
No.
fairly popular in like Eastern Asian cultures, and it's like traditional Eastern medicine to help regulate blood sugar. And a friend of my professor's was developing this product that's an extract of bitter melon, and we were trying to test it to see if it had anti-diabetic properties, essentially, if it could help regulate blood sugar and improve insulin sensitivity. There's been like numerous animal studies and cell culture studies that show that mechanistically it should theoretically improve blood sugar regulation. So this would have been the first study in humans. The reason I say it would have is because the project was actually terminated halfway through due to some like just bad circumstances, essentially. So I worked on this project for 2 years, didn't really get much out of it. But anecdotally, I did see some improvements in blood sugar regulation with some of the participants. Now, that was not doing any statistical analysis or anything like that. That was just like me looking at where they started, where they were after. So it's hard to say if the effect was just due to the supplement, or maybe because they were in the study, they were having other lifestyle modifications. So we can't conclusively say that it was beneficial, but I did see some positive trends there. In terms of my dissertation work, we were looking at the effects of dried plums, so prunes. For those of you guys that have seen your grandparents drinking prune juice, there's actually something to it. So we had previously done, probably in like 2014, 2015, a study in postmenopausal women, seeing whether or not consuming prunes daily can help attenuate bone loss. So after menopause, one of the big issues that women face is bone loss. And that's partially due to the drastic loss of estrogen following menopause. Estrogen plays a very important role in bone health and bone homeostasis in general. And prunes have many different compounds that seem to be beneficial for bone. Some of those compounds are phytoestrogens that have estrogen-like properties. So phytoestrogens are plant compounds that have estrogen-like properties. They're found in prunes, they're found in soy products, they're found in various different plant foods. But prunes are also rich in vitamin K, which is important for bone health. They are one of the few plant foods that have boron to significant levels that may improve bone health. So it seems like the different compounds in prunes can be beneficial for bone. We provided the prunes on a daily basis in either 50 grams, which is like 4 or 5 prunes, or 100 grams, which is 10 prunes. That's a lot of prunes to eat. But they were eating these prunes daily for a whole year. And what we found is, and this has been replicated now several studies, that prunes dose-dependently prevent loss of bone. Okay, so they didn't necessarily improve bone density, but they significantly attenuated the rate at which bone is lost, which is a positive finding, right? If you can maintain your bone after the age of 50 or so, that's really good, because the general trend is that bone density decreases. And there's few things that actually improve bone density. And one of those is exercise, so heavy resistance training. And another is just general high consumption of fruits and vegetables seems to be associated with improved bone density. And we were able to study prunes particularly and see that they're beneficial. So my dissertation was the same exact study, however, in older men. Older men also suffer from bone loss, not to the same degree as women. And it's obviously not due to a drastic decrease in estrogen. Although men do have estrogen and they do tend to decrease estrogen as they age. So it does seem like estrogen also plays a role in bone health in men, however, maybe not to the same degree as it does in women. So we were trying to see if the effects of the prunes were sex specific, because the mechanisms are slightly different there. And my study was only a 6-month study, and we didn't see any results. Now, there are various methodological differences, I think. One is that the men in our study didn't have a significant degree of bone loss to start with. So it may be that these men were just like a little too healthy to see beneficial effects of prunes, right? Because they also didn't lose a significant amount of bone over 6 months. Also, bone studies, at least in clinical populations, should last at least a year. Mine was 6 months for the purposes of graduation. So perhaps the study wasn't long enough to see beneficial effects. And then the other third big component, which we think is probably the major contributor, is that alongside from the prunes, these individuals were receiving a multivitamin that was rich in particular compounds that are beneficial for bone health. So the control group received it and both of the prune groups received it. And the reason being is because there's some like ethical complications associated with giving somebody absolutely nothing if you know that their condition is going to worsen, right? So let's say, I guess osteoporosis is serious, but maybe not as serious as like a terminal disease like cancer, for example. If you're doing cancer therapy, it's unethical to give the control group absolutely nothing, right? Essentially, you would compare something that you're experimenting with, and the control group would receive something that's known to work, and you would see whether the treatment is as effective as what's known to work. But it's not ethical to give them nothing because you know they're going to suffer from the disease, right? So we gave these people this multivitamin, which my major professor believes was a major confounding variable because it could have certainly helped bone health, and then that could have masked the effects of the prunes. But that is my dissertation work. That project is still ongoing because it was originally proposed as a 1-year study, so that's still ongoing. And we should see what the 1-year results show pretty soon, which is exciting.
And with all these different studies, I might be kind of getting into the weeds here, but were these findings or anything in the research, was it independent of calories?
So yeah, we don't control for caloric intake in a lot of these studies. So we don't regulate their food intake, but we do take into account their dietary intake. So we provide them food records. Now that's a huge limitation in clinical studies because it's been shown over and over that these 3-day food records, people do not accurately track. However, we ask them to track to the best of their abilities, and we do analysis on dietary intake between the groups, right? So when we do that, we control to the best we can, but it's really hard to control for diet, particularly in a study that is not focused on dietary control, right? We just want to see if including prunes in your diet will improve. However, we do randomize participants. So when a participant comes in to be included in the study, we randomize into one of the 3 groups. The sample size is pretty large, 200 participants for this study in particular. So the idea is that if you randomize into 3 different groups, the 3 groups should be relatively similar at baseline. Whether some people eat more or some people eat less, whether some people have a higher protein diet or lower protein diet. The idea is that with a large enough sample size and appropriate randomization, that the average between the groups would be similar.
Gotcha.
So that would account for any differences that you would see in caloric intake. So like you'll have some people who eat high calories, some people who eat low calories, but that'll be equal across the groups.
Gotcha.
And if that has an effect, it should be negated because it's similar across the groups.
Gotcha. And throughout all of this schooling that you did, was there something that you specifically found challenging or even made you kind of want to give up?
Yeah, I think every student, every PhD student experiences that to a certain degree, and everybody's experience is very unique. See, the difference with a PhD is that everybody's PhD experience is very unique, unlike an undergraduate experience where there's just like, these are the courses you take, these are the exams you take. Everybody goes through the same experience. The PhD experience is very different because although there is coursework takes up just like a third or a half of your the first portion of your PhD experience. The second half is just research based, and it's all based on how your mentor's mentoring strategy is, right? So like there is no standardization across labs for a PhD. So two students in the same university working with two professors can have vastly different experiences. So it was definitely some points where I felt like quitting, especially towards the end. So there was not much oversight in my lab. Like it was very much you're independent, learn things on your own. And I had some frustrations towards the end when I was analyzing my data, where like I was running these kits called ELISA kits. I had not had much education on how specifically to run them, so I'm trying to teach myself how to do them, and I think I'm doing them correctly. But then I analyze my data, and it just looks like, sorry for the language, but shit. It just looks horrible, right? And I'm like, man, I just spent like 10 hours doing these, and I just wasted my day. I have to come back and do this again tomorrow. And it happened like multiple times. And the frustrating part was that I didn't really know what I was doing wrong, because I was following the instructions on the manuals to a T, like doing everything correctly, consulted other professors, they couldn't tell what was going on. And eventually I had to run these tests multiple times. And towards the end, I had some success. Like some of the issues are also with like defects in the kit itself. So the manufacturer has to send you new ones. It was just a lot of troubleshooting that was pretty frustrating. Another big thing that was a big situation that I had to overcome was that first project that I mentioned to you that I worked on for 2 years and was terminated. That was a big hit because I thought that was going to be my dissertation work. I had been working on that project daily for roughly 2 years. And I had literally given presentations on the topic, had spent hours researching the topic, putting PowerPoint presentations together, educating myself in the area of prediabetes, insulin resistance, all that stuff. And then one day it's just like, nope, this project's over. Sorry for all the work you did, but we can't do anything with the data. And it wasn't my professor's fault. My professor actually reached out to the sponsors and asked if I could at least use the data that we had already collected for the purposes of my graduation. And it was a privately funded project, so their answer was no. And that was a really big blow because I was like, man, what do I do from here? I have to start all over. Thankfully, this project with the dried plums was currently ongoing. But one of the rules as a PhD student is that your project has to be, your hypothesis for your dissertation has to be your own, right? You can't just like take a project from your professor that's already ongoing and say that's your dissertation. You can use an ongoing project, but you have to come up with a unique spin on it. So like analyze something different, or just provide a hypothesis that wasn't originally provided in the original project. So it was a big transition from the prediabetes to the bone health area, because I had to educate myself on bone health. And then I had to think of like, I have to study like prunes and see what's in prunes. And then I had to come up with a hypothesis that was completely novel to what was originally proposed. And I eventually came up while reading through the literature on some novel quote unquote biomarkers that I looked at. So there were some like inflammatory molecules that compounds in prunes have been shown to modulate. And there was some animal data showing that those compounds are potentially involved in bone health. So that was like the connection I made there. Disclaimer, I didn't find any differences after the 6 months with the prunes, but at least I was able to come up with a novel idea that I was able to analyze for my PhD. And I'm sure there were a number of other experiences that were really frustrating that I probably just like hid somewhere in the back of my mind.
And then especially, with everyone, we all have strong biases about things. So from when your interest really started peaking, even when you're getting your bachelor's, when you're saying those classes, you really love taking them, to where you are today, has there been any significant change of mind that you've had about a certain topic in nutrition, something that you were completely wrong about maybe years ago?
Yeah. Um, I wouldn't say completely wrong, but I would say I used to have a much stronger opinion on what worked and what didn't work. So when I didn't know, when I wasn't involved in the research, and now that I like actually read a lot of research and see how much contradictory data there is, like previously, if like somebody taught me in a class that like a particular supplement was effective, like that was it for me. I was like, oh, the science says this, that supplement is effective. And now for most things, I'm like, I don't really know. And it's like kind of unfortunate because like the more you educate yourself, at least in the field of nutrition, you realize like most things are kind of on the fence. So I wouldn't say there was anything in general that I was like 100% gung ho on that I was completely wrong on. Like there's definitely general things that I was wrong on, particularly with like resistance training, because I wasn't formally educated in exercise science as much as I was in nutrition. Um, but maybe particularly like some training methods that maybe I thought were effective, or like, you know, the general notion that like higher repetitions are always better for hypertrophy and things like that. I was just much more opinionated than I am now. And I used to work with clients back in the day too, like finishing undergrad, I was a personal trainer. And when I worked with clients, like what I implemented, I thought was like the correct way. And I would listen to clients' opinions on particular things, or like maybe ideas that they had that they wanted to implement. And I would listen to them, but sometimes in my head I was like, oh, that doesn't make sense. Like I wouldn't really listen to what they had to say as much. Whereas now I know that like one, the adherence to the training protocol is extremely important, right? So even if something is ideal in terms of like textbook perfect, right? Like this is the perfect program. If the person doesn't enjoy it, it's probably not going to be effective. I know there's like different routes to get to the same result. So I'm just much less opinionated now, I guess, than I was before I really like delved into research and saw how much contradiction there was in everything.
And then one last question regarding your schooling. So I feel like, especially the last couple of years, I hear people talk about balance and having balance in your life all the time. Like it's very popular to talk about that. But I've kind of thought on the other end of the spectrum with that, because if I look at someone like you have the highest amount of education you can in what you're doing. It seems that there has to be parts of your life that have to be not balanced to get to kind of the highest level. So with you having your PhD, what is your opinion when people kind of obsess about wanting to be balanced their entire life?
Yeah, I think that also has to do with the individual's personality, because I am a relatively balanced person. Like I I was pursuing a PhD, but not because my end goal was to be like a top level researcher or be super into academia and like have that revolve around my life. I've always valued uh, my lifestyle more than my career, to be honest. So like I even say this to my friends, like my career is part of my life. I don't want my life to be my career. And I've made that very clear to myself, like for a while. I've just never wanted that. So for my PhD, I would say, and my friends like kind of laugh at this because even under like quote unquote stressful situations, I was fairly relaxed because again, like I said, like I knew that the PhD was not my life, right? There were definitely periods of time, like when I was doing analysis for my dissertation, I was in the lab like 10 hours a day for several weeks, and like that was just what I knew I had to do. I didn't think of it as being unbalanced, right? I guess when you're saying the word balance, you're thinking of like a fairly balanced day every single day your whole life.
Right, right.
Whereas that's necessarily not the case if you are, I guess, trying to be super successful in one particular area, right? Because there will be periods of time where you're extremely busy with whatever you have to accomplish for that one area. But there'll be times where you're fairly relaxed. So there were definitely weeks and even months during my PhD where, I felt like school was just a small component of my life. And there were periods of time where it was like all I did. but I never approached it with the mindset of like, this is taking away from the rest of my life or like anything like that. It was just part of my life, and I learned how to balance it with the other aspects of my life. So like for me, I never let school get in the way of like my training, for example. I've been consistently training. I'm talking about like lifting weights for the past 10 years, and like my schedule is my schedule. And I had friends who would say things like, I can't because I don't have time or whatever. But like my rest time was going to the gym, and I always made time for what my priorities were. So I do think you can be balanced in the sense that you can have time to do the things that you truly want to do. And for me, if like I had to write my dissertation, but if there was like a hard deadline is a different story. But if like I had to get a couple more pages done or something, like I was never stressed out by just like putting that off till tomorrow and like prioritizing my well-being and my health more than to the PhD. But I have other friends who have like a completely different experience where they're working 12-hour days for like all 4 years. But again, that has to do with the individual and how you prioritize different things in your life.
Awesome. And then I wanted to transition a bit into what you're doing now. So you're over there working as a BioLayne coach. So can you kind of talk about how that came to be and then what you're doing over there?
Sure. So like I mentioned, I never had the goal of being like a huge academic. And I knew that towards the end of my PhD, I wanted to transition away from academia to a certain degree. Like I want to be involved in research, but I don't necessarily want to be the researcher. And I really do enjoy teaching. So I work with BioLayne as a coach, but I also teach at Concordia University in Chicago. It's an online university, so my course is online. But I stay active teaching, I stay active in the research, and I do coaching. So one of the reasons why I wanted to transition out of academia, one is like monetary opportunities are not that great in academia. And a little bit selfish here, but if I went to school for a long time, I want to be able to make somewhat of a decent salary.
Of course, yeah.
And also, I did miss working with clients. I think one big gap when it comes to research in academia is that scientists publish for other scientists. Like the field of research is very tight-knit. Like research is written in a particular language that's hard for individuals to understand. There's not easy access to research, so like it's mainly behind a paywall where either the researcher pays to publish or the lay public has to pay to read the research, which blows my mind because most research is funded by taxpayer money. So like taxpayers are paying for research to be funded, and then they have to pay to read the research.
It seems a little backwards.
Oh, it's very backwards. A lot of science is backwards, unfortunately. But where was I? Oh, so I was saying a lot of the research doesn't get out to the general public. And like you mentioned, there's a lot of quackery when it comes to information with the relationship between coaching and clients. So I wanted to work with clients. Honestly, you can make a decent living working with clients one-on-one. Also, I felt like I could be helping bridge the gap between the scientific field and what individuals actually know by working with them one-on-one. So a big part of our coaching services is educational based. And clients will ask us questions during their check-ins on whatever topic they have questions about, and then that's where I like to come in and do a little bit of research and give them an educated answer and provide them to resources that are beneficial for them to read. So like I said, I enjoy teaching. I really like education, obviously. So I really enjoy that aspect of coaching. I've been involved with Lane and his team now for several years. For the past couple of years, I've just been like writing and reading research for them. So as you've seen, like a lot of the content Lane puts out is research based. So I was doing a lot of behind the scenes on like reading research articles and summarizing them for him. And then I mentioned like towards the end of my PhD career that I'd like to be involved in coaching as well. And positions opened up. So I was just kind of in the right place, right time. And this is another thing to emphasize. People have asked me like, oh, how'd you meet Lane? How'd you get involved with Lane? Because obviously Lane has a huge following He has a PhD in nutrition. In terms of like the field of nutrition and exercise, he's a pretty high up there in terms of big names. And I met him by shooting him an email.
So simple.
Like,
I love it.
yeah, exactly. Like anytime I've wanted to like work with somebody or have somebody as a mentor, I just like look for the email and send them a nice email, mention some compliments, why I like their work and why I'd like to work with them. And it's always worked in my favor, honestly. Like, and people are surprised that it's that simple. Like, really? Like they respond and I'm like, yeah, like if you're just nice and like reach out to people, I have reached out to people that just don't answer, but that's why I don't reach out to just one person. I'll find 4 or 5 people, reach out to all of them, and then whoever answers, I'll just, take the opportunity as it comes. But yeah, that's the reason I'm coaching. I'm also really interested in the supplement industry because there's a lot of pretty crappy supplements out there too, right? Like very few supplements actually work, but the ones that work can provide some benefits for athletes, right? So I would like to be more involved in the supplement industry as well as time goes on. I have a small role now with Layne's supplement company as well, Outwork Nutrition. Pretty much doing the same thing, like reading research, trying to see what supplements actually work, condensing all of the literature into like a database, stuff like that. And I really enjoy it. So those are the things I'm doing now, trying to transition more into like the entrepreneurial route. I have some ideas for maybe like writing some books in nutritional topics that I don't see too many books on. I'd really like to write a book on nutritional habits. So there's a lot of focus on like macronutrient intake and energy intake and how to diet and those things. But I haven't seen much emphasis in terms of like lifestyle habit changes. And in my opinion, if you want to succeed long term and have a quote unquote good physique, but just be generally healthy, sure, you can focus on macros, but like long term, I think you have to establish some habits that align with your lifestyle. And obviously, there's a lot of books on habit formation. Like one of the big names is what, Atomic Habits, right? That's general lifestyle habits that are beneficial. Awesome.
It's right here on my
That's too
desk.
funny. But I'd like to see a book like that that's specifically focused on nutritional habits. And there's a lot of information on Instagram on like nutritional habits, like eat at normal meal times every day and stuff like that, but not much on the science as to why those habits actually help. So that's just something that's been going on in my brain over the past couple of weeks, and I should probably just get to writing pretty soon. But yeah, those are kind of the things I'm working on now and some of the things I'd like to work on in the future.
Behavior change and habits it's a fascinating topic. I think I read stuff about it all the time. And yeah, like you said, I've always thought that too, or after learning more about it, that if someone is just telling you what macros to eat, but you're not learning about behavior change, it doesn't seem like it would necessarily be a good long-term plan, just like you were saying.
Yeah, even myself, I get asked the question of like, what are your macros? Like, how much do you eat? And I guess this is a bad answer because I do coach my clients using a macro approach because it's very easy to like see their progress over time and know how much they're eating. But I don't track anything for myself.
I love that.
It's been years. Like I used to track pretty diligently towards the end of undergraduate, but then I thought like, man, this is definitely adding stress to my life. And I'm not a competitive athlete. And, like I don't really care about being 6% body fat year round, but I've just through trial and error, honestly, developed habits that work for me. I stay pretty lean year round. I have visible abs, but I'm not like super ripped or anything like that. But it's the best part for me is that it's effortless. Just like the way I've been able to structure my day and my eating just like fits with my lifestyle, fits with my exercise, and like I don't have to give it much thought, and I maintain a body that I'm happy in and that is healthy just like year round without much effort at all. So that's something I try to emphasize with my clients. Like I do give them a macro recommendation because I think macro counting is really useful if you have like no education whatsoever, right?
Absolutely.
So you don't even know like a plate of food if that's like too much or too little. So I do think it's really useful for individuals to track their macros at first so that they can then have like a visual idea of like, hey, this plate looks a little too heavy or something like that, right? Or like people will even not know like if you look at a food, is it like a food that's rich in protein or carbohydrates, like very, very basic things. So I think it's a good approach, educational approach at least. But then as I coach my clients through time, I try to implement strategies like, for example, for myself, I have not the sweetest tooth, but I definitely have a sweet tooth. And so
Amen.
yeah. And I guess people would like to call this self-control or whatnot, but if I have a sweet tooth and I want to eat something sweet, I don't not have the sweet food, but I'll tell myself, I'm going to wait till I have my meal. And then if I eat my meal and I still want it, then I can have it. And I usually do want it still, but at a very much lower quantity. So like for me, it's things like chocolate and ice cream and stuff like that. And when I have my meal, I'll prioritize my protein. That's like the main thing for me.
Yep.
I'll prioritize getting a good amount of veggies in there. And then whatever carb source, and usually the amount of carbohydrate I add, like white rice or potato or whatnot, will be dependent on how active I was that day. So it's like I eat to fuel my exercise. I'm very much into cooking as well. So I think like one of the issues that people have sticking to a diet is that they don't know how to cook. So the food they cook tastes horrible. But if you learn how to make good food, it's easy, right? Because my meals are satisfying. Although it's like a quote unquote healthy meal, it's delicious. So I eat my meal and then I have a sweet tooth and I'll just like go to the ice cream, literally have like 1 or 2 spoonfuls and I'm good. I just wanted the flavor of something sweet and I'm already full. So I'm good to go. Whereas a lot of people will have their sweets while they're cooking the food. It's like they're cooking dinner while having some snacks, so it's just like very little changes. And I'm sure you're laughing because I've done it too. Like we all do it, right? And it's things that we're not even mindful of. Another easy strategy is like, if you were dieting and, you're on low calories and you're hungry, like even something as simple as like having a tall 16-ounce glass of water prior to your meal, that has been shown in the research to increase satiety, because one of the mechanisms by which we feel full is actually the stretch of the stomach. So there are mechanoreceptors that are sensitive to stretch. And if you add water, that's more volume, it's going to stretch the stomach, it's going to tell your brain you're full. So it's just like super simple strategies that you can implement to increase dietary adherence. Yeah, that's pretty much what I do and why I think that these habits are so important. I honestly forgot what the question was, but
I don't remember exactly either, but I loved everything that you said.
Thank you.
And I have to ask this to every person I have on my show that has a background in fitness or nutrition. And it's going to be one of the last questions I ask you. What are some of the most frustrating myths that you hear and that just won't die? It could be fitness or nutrition related.
Myths. The carbohydrate making you gain weight. That one's ridiculous, right? Because the idea is, the whole idea is that insulin is a quote unquote storage hormone. And so if you spike insulin, anything that you ate is directly stored as fat. And that's just like completely not true, right? So insulin is a quote unquote anabolic hormone where it causes tissues to grow. When people think of anabolic, they think muscle growth, but the word anabolism technically just means the growth of a tissue. So if you get fatter, that is anabolism of fatty tissue. If you get more jacked, that's anabolism of the muscle, right? So insulin is an anabolic hormone. So if you consume a carbohydrate-rich meal and you are in excess calories, so like you're in a caloric surplus, yes, those excess calories will be stored as fat. It doesn't matter if they come from fat. It doesn't matter if they come from carbohydrate. The mechanism as to which they're stored as fat is different, but nonetheless, they're stored as fat. When you eat carbohydrates, any carbohydrate really gets broken down into glucose. So the other myth is that like eat complex carbs, don't eat sugar, right? I agree with that for other reasons, but not because of the reason that sugar is bad. Complex carbs are good, because at the end of the day, when you eat a complex carb, it's broken down into sugar. So when you have glucose in the bloodstream, you release insulin, and the role of insulin is to help lower that blood sugar. The first place that blood sugar goes into is the liver. Okay, so the liver gets as much as it needs and then it goes back into circulation. So now you've already reduced a certain amount of glucose because the liver is highly metabolically active, takes up a bunch of glucose, and now the rest of the glucose that's not used up by the liver goes back into circulation. The second place, well, the brain is also a big consumer of glucose, but I'm going to be talking about liver, muscle, fat, okay?
Got it.
So after the liver goes back into circulation, the muscle then gets priority. The muscle is going to take up some glucose and use that for energy production, right? Every time we move, any sort of movement, muscles using up energy. And then if there's any glucose left over, well, muscles going to use them for energy, liver's going to use them for energy. Some will also be used as storage as glycogen, right? So you're going to store some glycogen in the muscle and in the liver. And then if there's any leftover glucose, it'll be stored as fat. Okay. So the reason why I'm saying that is because if you are in a caloric deficit, aka eating less calories than the energy that you are expending, there is going to be no leftover glucose to store as fat. It's going to be used up, right? Either the liver's going to use it, the brain's going to use it, the muscle's going to use it, or it's going to be stored as glycogen. Typically, a lot of it will be stored as glycogen. That's one of the reasons why when you are losing weight, your muscles look more flat. It's because there's just not as much glycogen in there, and glycogen draws in water into the muscle, so it makes the muscle look more full, right? So if you're in a calorie deficit, and you have the idea that a carbohydrate is going to make you fat because insulin is equally anabolic towards muscle as it is fat. Like insulin is just helping glucose be shuttled into different tissues. Insulin does not say, hey, store fat. So that's just, I guess, a misconception on the role of insulin and why carbohydrates make you fat. Another big one is like, I made like a silly video on this, but that white carbohydrates are bad, as if like the color of a food dictates its health benefits. Kind of silly, right? So it comes from the idea that like white rice is refined, white bread is refined, not much nutritional value. But that's all context specific too. Like if you're an athlete who needs to fuel exercise, white rice is probably your friend because you just need some energy. It's easy to digest, gets into the bloodstream quickly. So that's context specific, and it's not necessarily bad for you in the fact that it has negative health effects. It's just like quote unquote empty calories, but some people need that. And then that like gets translated into like, oh, well, like sweet potatoes are good and white potatoes are bad. Well, like white potatoes are, in my opinion, one of the best foods you can consume. They're extremely satiating, low calorie density, high in potassium. Like they're just a great food overall, but people think like, oh, they're white, you shouldn't eat them. It's just like very silly things that like, I guess people try to apply common sense to it, but the common sense is like based off false logic. So
Right.
I guess that's in the nutritional field. And there's also like a whole bunch when it comes to training. And that's like a wormhole that we can talk about for hours. Like, I don't know how big the whole like muscle confusion thing is anymore, but that used to be huge, right? Like you have to do different exercises to infuse the muscle and give it a new stimulus. That's not necessarily true. You can stick with a handful, like exercise variety is important in terms of like having different exercises in your training program to target particular muscles from different angles and target different muscle fibers. But the idea that you have to change exercises every week or every several weeks is completely wrong. In my own training, I have exercises that I have not changed in years. Why? Because they feel good. I continue to make progress in them. And they're exercises that align with my anatomy, my anthropometry, and they feel good for my body, right? I think the only reason why people should switch an exercise is one, if they're failing to progress that exercise. Two, if that exercise is causing them sort of pain or injury, right? Like there's particular exercises that for me don't feel good. I've injured myself performing them several times. I don't do them. And the third reason would just be like you don't enjoy them, right? There's exercises. I mean, if you don't like squatting because they're hard, that's not a reason, right? But
Everyone's going to do that now. They're going to say that it's your fault that they don't squat.
But for example, like a squat, right? There's different ways to squat. It's important to have a squat in your exercise training program, but like if you're not a power lifter, you don't have to do a low bar squat to 90 degrees just because somebody said you do. Like if you don't enjoy that style of squatting, there's different styles of squatting. So enjoyment, I think, is big, because if you enjoy the movement, you're going to put more effort into it. And I think, honestly, I'm not sure if I'm missing anything, but I think those are the three major reasons as to why somebody should change an exercise. And those are really the only reasons. There's no like magical thing that says switch to an exercise, make more progress. At least not that I've seen in the science. So those are some of the big myths for sure.
Awesome. I could literally talk to you for hours about stuff like that. I love hearing, the science behind everything.
Yeah.
So this is going to be the last part of the show. I have one more question for you. I want you to get the floor again for a couple minutes. So if someone out there is looking to do something in their life at the highest level, similar to what you did, if you wanted to go all in and get a PhD, what does that really take to do something like that?
Just commitment. I think people maybe overemphasize, like, especially for like a PhD or something like that. Like, sure, you have to be smart, but it's like you don't have to be a genius. You don't really need special qualifications for anything, really, in my opinion, unless you're trying to be like an NBA player, like top level athlete. Yeah, you need to have certain body type. But for general things like having a PhD or pursuing a particular career, I think it just takes commitment, honestly. I don't think I had any special qualifications that suggested that I should be a doctor in nutrition. Honestly, in high school, I was doing so poorly that I didn't even know if I would get into college. And that mainly stemmed from like certain household issues, I think, growing up, and struggles that I had to face that like made me not do well in school. Not necessarily that I didn't have the capacity to, but I think one, believing in yourself, two, be committed, and three, don't burn yourself out by letting it like consume your life. Right? That's something regarding the balance that we were talking about. In any aspect of life, really. Like, I think, like I said, balance doesn't mean every day is equally balanced, but balance in terms of the general lifestyle is very important, right? You can get burned out if you just focus on one thing 24/7. Some people will say the opposite, but I don't agree with that. And just be committed. Be committed to educating yourself in the field. Be committed to, if it's science, be committed to the science itself, and just take everything one day at a time. Another big thing is I think people try to get ahead of themselves, like focus on like the end goal, whereas I never really focused on the end goal. And again, I'm just talking from my personal experience, but even when I started my PhD, and even now, like people would ask me, like, what's your end career goal? What are you trying to do in 10 years? Like, those are such common questions, right? And I always answer like, I don't know. I kind of just like, this is how I've always approached life. I just like see what opportunities are presented to me short term. I'll think about them and take the opportunity that I think is best and kind of just roll with it and take it day at a time and celebrate small successes. Like during my PhD, when I finished my coursework, which was the big part, I was like, awesome, done with my coursework. Next step is the prospectus. Just work on that, focus on that. When I got that done, awesome, I'm done with that. I never was like, man, I finished my coursework, I still have 2 more years. Just like focus on everything one step at a time. At the end of the day, like the years are going to go by whether you focus on them or not. So I have a fairly relaxed approach. I just think just stay committed to your goal, try your best, and just relax, and things will happen for you.
I love it. And where can people connect with you, or if they're looking to hire you, where can they do that?
Awesome. Thank you for that opportunity. If you want to follow me, I'm mainly just really active on Instagram. I post daily educational content about blah, 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 nutrition, training, and some just other random interests that I have. You can find me at Dr. Joey Munoz. That's Munoz. So again, Dr.Joey Munoz. And if you'd like to hire me, you can email me at joseph@biolayne.com. That is BIOLAYME.
Fantastic. I will make sure to link all of those in the show description. And thank you, everyone, for listening to the Mission Driven Made podcast. If you found value in this today or it made you think a little bit more, subscribe to the show, take just a few seconds and leave a 5-star review and then share it with someone else today. Sir, thank you for being on the show and bringing so much value to all the listeners today. And until next time, everyone, stay mission driven.